The cold October wind cut through Thomas's thin jacket like a knife. He pulled the worn fabric tighter around his shoulders, but it did little to keep out the chill that seemed to reach right into his bones. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that it had been 3 days since his last real meal. 3 long days of nothing but water from public fountains and the half-eaten sandwich someone had thrown away outside the bus station. Thomas walked slowly down Maple Street, his eyes scanning the busy sidewalk for any sign of hope. People hurried past him without making eye contact, their heads down, lost in their own worlds. He understood. Just 2 years ago he had been one of them, rushing to meetings, checking his phone, completely unaware of the invisible people living on the streets around him. His feet ached in his old shoes. The soles had worn so thin that he could feel every crack in the pavement. Each step reminded him of how far he had fallen, how different his life used to be. But he couldn't think about that now. Right now he needed to focus on one thing: finding food. As he turned the corner, Thomas saw it. A small cafe with warm yellow light spilling out onto the street. Through the large windows he could see people sitting at tables, laughing and talking over steaming cups of coffee. The smell of fresh bread and soup drifted out every time someone opened the door. His mouth watered and his stomach cramped with hunger. But what caught his attention wasn't the food. It was the beautiful black piano sitting near the front window. Even from outside he could see how well cared for it was. The wood gleamed under the soft lights and the keys looked perfectly white and clean. It had been so long since he had seen a piano like that. Thomas stood on the sidewalk for several minutes just staring. His fingers twitched slightly, remembering the feel of keys beneath them. He could almost hear music in his mind, melodies that had once filled concert halls and brought audiences to their feet. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now. A group of college students walked past him, chatting excitedly about their weekend plans. One of them bumped into him slightly and muttered sorry without really looking. Thomas barely noticed. His eyes were still fixed on the piano. He knew what he had to do, but the thought terrified him. What if they called the police? What if they laughed at him? What if they threw him out and banned him from ever coming back? But his hunger was stronger than his fear now. He had to try. Thomas pushed open the cafe door and a wave of warm air hit his face. The contrast from the cold street was almost overwhelming. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the light. The cafe was busier than it had looked from outside. Nearly every table was full, and there was a steady hum of conversation mixed with the soft jazz music playing from hidden speakers. He could smell everything now. Fresh coffee, baked goods, soup, sandwiches. His stomach cramped again, more painfully this time. A few people near the door glanced at him, their expressions changing slightly when they took in his appearance. He knew how he looked. His clothes were clean but old and worn. His hair needed cutting and he hadn't shaved in several days. He tried to stand up straighter to look more respectable. Thomas spotted the manager behind the counter. Mr. Rodriguez was a man in his 40s with kind eyes but a no-nonsense attitude. He was wiping down the espresso machine with quick, efficient movements. Thomas had been watching the cafe for 2 days, trying to work up the courage for this moment. He knew Mr. Rodriguez arrived at 7 each morning and stayed until closing. He seemed like a fair man, but Thomas also knew he ran a business. Taking a deep breath, Thomas walked slowly toward the counter. His legs felt shaky, partly from hunger and partly from nerves. Several customers were waiting in line, so he stood behind them, rehearsing what he would say in his head. The words had to be perfect. He would only get one chance. When the last customer walked away with their order, Mr. Rodriguez looked up at Thomas. For a moment, neither man spoke. Thomas could see the question in the manager's eyes, the slight concern about why someone who clearly wasn't planning to buy anything was standing in his cafe. "Excuse me, sir," Thomas finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "I know this might sound strange, and I understand if you say no, but I was wondering if I could ask you something." Mr. Rodriguez set down his cleaning cloth and crossed his arms. His expression wasn't unfriendly, but it wasn't welcoming either. "What can I do for you?" Thomas glanced around the cafe, suddenly very aware that other people were listening. A woman at a nearby table had looked up from her book. A businessman had paused in reading his newspaper. Thomas felt his face grow warm with embarrassment, but he pushed forward. "I see you have a piano over there," he said, gesturing toward the beautiful instrument by the window. It's a gorgeous piece. Really beautiful. Mr. Rodriguez followed his gaze to the piano, then looked back at Thomas with growing confusion. Yes, it is. My wife picked it out when we opened this place 5 years ago. What about it? This was it. The moment Thomas had been building up to for hours. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone in the cafe could hear it. I was wondering, I know this sounds crazy, but would you let me play it? Just for a little while? In exchange for maybe just a bowl of soup or a sandwich? I haven't eaten in 3 days, and I promise I won't cause any trouble. The words hung in the air between them. Thomas watched Mr. Rodriguez's face, trying to read his expression. The manager's eyebrows had risen slightly, and his mouth was partly open as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. From somewhere behind Thomas, someone chuckled softly. He didn't turn around to see who it was, but the sound made his cheeks burn with shame. This had been a mistake. He should have known better. He should have just kept walking and found some other way to get food. Mr. Rodriguez shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, there was a hint of amusement in his voice that cut deeper than anger would have. Look, friend, I understand you're hungry, but this isn't how things work. That piano cost more than most people make in a year. I can't just let anyone off the street come in and play it like it's some kind of toy. Thomas felt his last bit of hope crumble. He nodded slowly, understanding that this had been exactly the response he should have expected. He was turning to leave when a voice from across the cafe stopped him. Wait just a minute there, young man. Thomas froze halfway to the door. The voice belonged to an elderly woman sitting alone at a corner table near the piano. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and wore a purple cardigan that looked hand-knitted. Her table was covered with papers and what looked like sheet music. She had been so quiet that Thomas hadn't even noticed her before. Mrs. Chen had been coming to this cafe every Tuesday afternoon for the past 3 years. She always ordered the same thing, chamomile tea and a blueberry scone. She always sat at the same table, the one with the best view of the piano, and she always brought her music compositions to work on in the peaceful atmosphere. She looked directly at Mr. Rodriguez, her brown eyes sharp and determined. Roberto, how long have I been coming here? Mr. Rodriguez looked surprised by her intervention. Mrs. Chen, you've been one of our best customers since we opened. But this is different. I can't just, that wasn't what I asked you, she said firmly, setting down her teacup with a gentle clink. How long? 3 years, he admitted, clearly uncomfortable with where this conversation was heading. 3 years, she repeated, nodding slowly. And in all that time, have I ever asked you for a single favor? Thomas stood perfectly still, afraid to move or speak. He could feel the eyes of other customers on him, some curious, others annoyed by the disruption to their quiet afternoon. A mother with 2 small children had stopped mid-conversation to watch. A teenager with headphones had pulled them down to listen better. Mr. Rodriguez shifted his weight from one foot to the other. No, ma'am, you haven't. Then I'm asking for one now, Mrs. Chen said, standing up slowly from her chair. She was smaller than she had appeared sitting down, probably no more than 5 feet tall, but something about her presence made her seem much larger. Let this man play the piano. Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, you don't understand. That piano is worth a fortune. We have insurance requirements, liability issues. What if he damages it? What if he doesn't? She interrupted. What if you're wrong about him? Thomas felt his throat tighten. No one had stood up for him in so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like. This woman didn't even know him, had never seen him before. But she was willing to put her reputation with the cafe on the line for a complete stranger. Look, Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice softer now. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I have a business to run. I can't make exceptions just because someone asks nicely. Mrs. Chen walked slowly toward the counter, her cane tapping softly on the tile floor. Thomas noticed she moved carefully as if her joints ached, but her back was straight and her head held high. When she reached the counter, she looked up at Mr. Rodriguez with the kind of expression that probably made her very effective as a grandmother. Roberto, she said quietly, do you know what I did before I retired? He shook his head, clearly curious despite his frustration. I taught music for 42 years. Elementary school, high school, private lessons. I've heard thousands of people play piano over the years. Good players, bad players, beginners, experts. And in all that time, I've learned something important. She paused, glancing back at Thomas, who was still standing frozen near the door. I've learned that you can tell a lot about a person by how they look at a piano. Most people see an expensive piece of furniture. Some see a toy to bang on. A few see it as background decoration. She turned back to Mr. Rodriguez. But some people, very few people, look at a piano the way that man just did. How did he look at it? Mr. Rodriguez asked, despite himself. Like he was seeing an old friend he hadn't talked to in years. The cafe had grown quieter. Even the soft jazz music seemed less noticeable. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat in the silence that followed Mrs. Chen's words. I still don't think, Mr. Rodriguez began. One song, Mrs. Chen said firmly. Give him one song. If he can't play, if he damages anything, if there's any problem at all, I'll personally pay for whatever needs to be fixed. I'll even cover his meal myself. Thomas's eyes widened. He wanted to protest, to tell her she didn't need to do that, but the words wouldn't come. His voice seemed to have disappeared entirely. Mr. Rodriguez looked from Mrs. Chen to Thomas and back again. Thomas could see him struggling with the decision. On one hand, he clearly respected Mrs. Chen and didn't want to disappoint her. On the other hand, he was running a business, and businesses had rules for good reasons. The teenager with the headphones suddenly spoke up. Come on, man, just let him try. What's the worst that could happen? A few other customers murmured agreement. The mother with the children nodded encouragingly. Even the businessman who had been reading his newspaper looked up and said, I'd like to hear what he can do. Thomas felt a strange mix of hope and terror. All these people were suddenly invested in whether or not he could play. What if he had built this up in his mind? What if his fingers had forgotten how to move properly? What if 3 years of living on the streets had somehow damaged his ability to play? Mr. Rodriguez sighed deeply and rubbed his temples. This is against my better judgment, he said finally. But Mrs. Chen, if anything goes wrong, it won't, she said confidently. One song, Mr. Rodriguez said, looking directly at Thomas. One song, and then regardless of how it goes, you need to leave quietly. No arguments, no drama. Are we clear? Thomas found his voice at last. Yes, sir, absolutely, thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me, Mr. Rodriguez said, gesturing toward Mrs. Chen. Thank her. And for the record, I still think this is a terrible idea. Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time since the conversation began. The best ideas usually seem terrible at first, Roberto. Thomas walked slowly toward the piano, aware that every person in the cafe was watching him. His legs felt unsteady, and his hands were trembling slightly. Not from the cold this time, but from nerves and anticipation, and something that might have been excitement. The piano looked even more beautiful up close. The wood was polished to a perfect shine, and he could see his reflection in the surface. The keys were ivory, real ivory, not the plastic substitutes he had seen on cheaper instruments. This was a serious piano, the kind that deserved serious music. He pulled out the bench and sat down carefully. The height was perfect, exactly what he would have chosen. He placed his hands gently on the keys without pressing down, just feeling their smooth surface under his fingertips. Behind him, he could hear people pulling out their phones. Someone whispered, "This is going to be good," while someone else said, "This is going to be embarrassing." Thomas tried to block out their voices and focus on the instrument in front of him. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It was time to find out if the music was still there. Thomas sat at the piano bench for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 seconds. His hands rested on the keys without making a sound. The cafe had fallen completely silent. Even the espresso machine had stopped hissing. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see what would happen next. His heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. What if he had forgotten how to play? What if his fingers were too stiff from the cold? What if 3 years of not touching a piano had somehow erased everything he once knew? The doubt crept into his mind like poison, but then he pressed down on middle C, just one note, soft and clear. The sound seemed to fill the entire cafe, rich and warm and perfect. The piano was beautifully tuned, probably better than any instrument he had played in years. He pressed the note again, then added the C above it, then below it. Simple notes, but they felt like coming home. Thomas closed his eyes and let his hands find their way across the keys. He started with something gentle, a melody that had been running through his head for days. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple tune that sounded like it could have been written for a music box. His left hand found the bass notes while his right hand picked out the melody line. The first few notes were tentative, careful. He was still afraid, still worried that he might embarrass himself in front of all these people. But as the melody continued, something began to change. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing became deeper. The fear started to fade away, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Pure joy. Mrs. Chen, who was still standing near the counter, smiled softly. She had been right about the way he looked at the piano. This wasn't someone who had learned a few songs from YouTube videos. This was someone who understood music from the inside out. Thomas moved into a more complex piece, his hands beginning to dance across the keys with growing confidence. The simple melody transformed into something richer, with harmonies weaving in and out like conversations between old friends. His left hand played a steady rhythm while his right hand told a story with notes that seemed to float and spin through the air. The businessman who had been reading his newspaper slowly folded it and set it aside. The mother with 2 children whispered to them to sit still and listen. The teenager put his phone away without even realizing he was doing it. Something magical was happening, and everyone in the cafe could feel it. But Thomas was just getting started. As his confidence grew, he began to play something more challenging. His fingers moved faster now, but every note was clear and precise. The music seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him, a place that had been locked away for too long. He played a piece that started soft and gentle, like raindrops on a window. Then it began to build, growing stronger and more passionate with each measure. His hands moved independently across the keys, the left hand providing a foundation, while the right hand soared above it like a bird taking flight. Mr. Rodriguez stood behind the counter with his mouth slightly open. He had expected maybe a few chopsticks or a simple children's song. He had not expected this. This was the kind of playing you heard in concert halls, not coffee shops. The music continued to grow more complex and beautiful. Thomas's whole body was moving now, swaying slightly with the rhythm, his face peaceful and focused. This was what he had been born to do, what he had trained for years to perfect. Every finger knew exactly where to go. Every note rang out with perfect timing and expression. A woman at a corner table had tears in her eyes. She whispered to her friend, "I've never heard anything like this in person before." Her friend just nodded, unable to speak. Thomas transitioned into another piece, this one starting with deep, rich bass notes that seemed to rumble up from the very foundation of the piano. Then his right hand joined in with a melody that was both heartbreaking and hopeful at the same time. The music told a story without words, speaking directly to something deep inside everyone who was listening. The teenage boy pulled out his phone again, but this time it was to record the performance. He had never been interested in classical music before, but this was different. This was music that made him feel things he didn't even have names for. As Thomas played, more people began to gather around the piano. Customers from other tables quietly moved closer, not wanting to disturb the music but unable to stay away. A few people from the street had noticed the crowd through the windows and came inside to see what was happening. The piece he was playing now required incredible technical skill. His hands were moving so fast they seemed to blur, but every note was perfect. The melody jumped and spun and danced, sometimes playful, sometimes serious, always beautiful. This wasn't just someone who could play piano. This was someone who could make the piano sing. Mrs. Chen moved closer to the instrument, her eyes never leaving Thomas's hands. She had taught music for 4 decades, and she had rarely seen technique this advanced. Whoever this man was, wherever he had come from, he had spent years perfecting his craft. The music reached a climax that made several people gasp out loud. Thomas's hands were flying across the entire keyboard, from the deepest bass notes to the highest treble, creating a sound that was almost orchestral in its richness and complexity. Yet somehow, even in the most difficult passages, the music never lost its emotional center. It wasn't just showing off technical ability. It was telling a story about loss and hope and the power of beauty to transform pain into something meaningful. As the piece began to wind down, Thomas's playing became softer again, more gentle. The notes seemed to float in the air like leaves falling from a tree. His left hand played a simple accompaniment, while his right hand picked out a melody that was both sad and peaceful. The cafe had filled up with people during the performance. Word had somehow spread outside, and customers from neighboring shops had wandered in to listen. Everyone was completely silent. afraid that even breathing too loudly might disturb the magic that was happening. Thomas played the final notes with such tenderness that several people in the audience started crying without knowing why. The last note hung in the air for a long moment before slowly fading away into perfect silence. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The silence was as powerful as the music had been. Then someone started clapping, and within seconds the entire cafe erupted in applause. People were not just clapping politely the way they might for any entertainment. They were applauding the way audiences do when they have just witnessed something truly extraordinary. Thomas opened his eyes and looked around, seeming almost surprised to find himself surrounded by people. For the last 15 minutes he had been completely lost in the music, unaware of anything except the piano and the melodies flowing through his fingers. The applause continued for a full minute. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes. Others were shaking their heads in amazement. Mr. Rodriguez just stood behind the counter, staring at Thomas like he was seeing him for the first time. The applause slowly died down, but people remained gathered around the piano. Thomas sat quietly on the bench, his hands still resting on the keys, looking almost as surprised as everyone else by what had just happened. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after something beautiful, when nobody wants to be the first to break the spell. Mrs. Chen was the first to approach him. She walked slowly, her cane tapping softly on the floor until she stood right beside the piano. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle but filled with amazement. "My dear boy," she said quietly, "where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Thomas looked up at her, then around at all the faces staring at him. He could see the curiosity in their eyes, the questions they all wanted to ask. For a moment he didn't know what to say. How could he explain 3 years of living on the streets to people who had just heard him play like a professional musician? He started, then stopped. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I used to play professionally." A murmur went through the small crowd. The teenager who had been recording stepped closer. "Professionally? Like you were in a band or something?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, not a band. I was a classical pianist. I played with orchestras, gave solo concerts, taught at the music conservatory downtown." He paused, looking down at his hands. "That was a long time ago, though." Mr. Rodriguez moved out from behind the counter, his expression completely different from what it had been 20 minutes earlier. "The conservatory? You mean the Metropolitan Music Conservatory?" "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "I taught there for 8 years. Before that, I performed with symphony orchestras across the country. I had a recording contract, gave concerts in some of the most famous halls in America." He looked around at their faces, seeing the disbelief and confusion. "I know it's hard to believe looking at me now." Mrs. Chen sat down carefully in the chair beside the piano. "What happened?" she asked softly. "How did you go from that to—" She gestured gently at his worn clothes and tired appearance. Thomas was quiet for a long time. The cafe had grown even more silent, if that was possible. Even the people who had just wandered in from the street seemed to sense that something important was happening. "My wife got sick," he said finally. "Cancer. She was a violinist, actually. That's how we met, at a chamber music festival in Boston 15 years ago. She was the most talented musician I've ever known, and the most beautiful person inside and out." He stopped talking for a moment, lost in the memory. Nobody rushed him. They could all see the pain in his eyes, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. "The treatments were expensive," he continued. "Even with insurance, the bills kept coming. Experimental treatments, specialists, medications that cost thousands of dollars a month. I sold everything I could. My piano, my car, eventually even our house. I took out loans, borrowed money from friends, used up all our savings." The mother with 2 small children had moved closer, her hand over her heart. The businessman who had been reading his newspaper was listening intently, his face serious and sympathetic. "She fought for 2 years, Thomas said, his voice getting quieter. 2 long years of hospitals and treatments and hoping for a miracle. I stopped performing, stopped teaching, spent every day with her. I didn't care about the money or my career. All I wanted was for her to get better." Mrs. Chen reached out and gently touched his arm. "Did she?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice again, it was barely audible. 3 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in November. I was holding her hand and she just slipped away. Several people in the small crowd were crying now. The teenager who had been so excited to record everything had put his phone away and was wiping his eyes with his sleeve. After that, Thomas continued, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't play, couldn't teach, couldn't even listen to music. Every note reminded me of her. I had no money left, no job, and all these debts that I couldn't pay. I lost our apartment within 6 months. What about your friends? Asked the businessman. Other musicians, colleagues from the conservatory? Thomas smiled sadly. Some tried to help at first, but when you're grieving and broke and can't do the thing you've built your whole life around, it's hard to maintain relationships. People have their own lives, their own problems. And I wasn't exactly good company. I was angry and depressed and pretty much impossible to be around. He looked down at his hands again, flexing his fingers slightly. I started drinking too much. Not all at once, but gradually. It was the only thing that made the pain go away, even temporarily. When you're living in your car and all your friends stop calling and you can't afford to eat regularly, alcohol becomes a very tempting escape. Mr. Rodriguez shook his head. But your talent, surely someone would have helped you get back on your feet professionally. You have to understand, Thomas said. In the classical music world, reputation is everything. Once word gets around that you're unreliable, that you miss rehearsals or show up to lessons unprepared, opportunities disappear very quickly. And when you're struggling with grief and depression and drinking, you make a lot of mistakes you can't take back. He gestured around the cafe. I've been living on the streets for almost 2 years now. Shelters when the weather's really bad, under bridges when they're full. I tried to get work, but who's going to hire someone with no address, no phone, and 3 years of unemployment? I did day labor when I could find it, but mostly I just survived. But you kept your musical ability, Mrs. Chen observed. Your hands, your memory, your technique. None of that was lost. Thomas looked at her with something that might have been surprise. I guess it wasn't. I thought it was gone forever. I haven't touched a piano in 3 years, haven't even hummed a melody, but when I sat down just now it all came flooding back. Like riding a bicycle, I suppose. No, said Mrs. Chen firmly. Not like riding a bicycle. What you just did requires decades of training and practice. That level of musicianship doesn't just come from muscle memory. It comes from something much deeper. She stood up slowly, looking around at the assembled crowd. This man isn't just someone who used to play piano. This is one of the most gifted musicians I've heard in 40 years of teaching music. The teenager spoke up again. So what happens now? I mean, you just proved that you can still play better than anyone I've ever heard. Doesn't that change everything? Thomas looked around at all the hopeful faces surrounding him. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something he had thought was gone forever. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Maybe it was hope. Hope. Thomas hadn't even remembered what the word meant until this moment. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, and for the first time in 3 years he saw something other than pity or indifference in people's eyes. He saw respect, admiration, and something even more powerful, belief. Mrs. Chen was the first to act. She reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, pressing it into Thomas's hand. This is for the most beautiful music I've heard in years, she said firmly. And I want you to know something. I've been teaching music for 4 decades, and I recognize real talent when I hear it. What you have isn't just skill. It's a gift. Before Thomas could protest or thank her, the teenager stepped forward. Man, that was incredible. I posted some of it on my social media, and people are already asking who you are. He pulled out his wallet and added a $10 bill to Mrs. Chen's 20. I've never heard anything like that in person. The businessman folded his newspaper and walked over. I run a small marketing company downtown, he said, handing Thomas his business card along with another $20. If you ever want to get back into performing, I'd be happy to help you figure out how to get started again. No charge. One by one, other customers began approaching. The mother with 2 children gave him $5 and told him his music had made her daughter stop crying for the first time all day. An elderly man who had been sitting quietly in the corner contributed another 10 and said the performance reminded him of concerts he had attended with his late wife. Within 10 minutes, Thomas had more money in his hands than he had seen in months. But more importantly, he had something he had lost completely. People believed in him again. Mr. Rodriguez had been watching all of this from behind the counter, his expression thoughtful and increasingly guilty. Finally, he walked over to where Thomas was still sitting at the piano bench, now surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice sincere. "When you first walked in here, I saw what I expected to see. A homeless person looking for a handout. I didn't see a musician, and I certainly didn't see someone with your level of talent." Thomas started to speak, but Mr. Rodriguez held up his hand. "Let me finish. I've been running this cafe for 5 years, and I've always wanted it to be more than just a place to get coffee. I wanted it to be a place where people could experience something special. Today you gave everyone here something they'll remember for the rest of their lives." He paused, looking around at the crowd that was still gathered around the piano. "I have a proposition for you. How would you feel about playing here regularly? Maybe 3 or 4 afternoons a week during our busiest times? I can't pay you a full salary, but I can offer you a hot meal every day you play, plus tips from customers, and maybe we can work out something more substantial if it goes well." Thomas stared at him in disbelief. You want me to work here?" "I want you to bring music to this place," Mr. Rodriguez said. "Real music, the kind that makes people stop what they're doing and really listen. What you did today, that's not just entertainment. That's art." Mrs. Chen clasped her hands together, beaming. "Oh, that's a wonderful idea. Roberto, you're a good man for making this offer." The teenager looked excited. "Dude, if you play here regularly, this place is going to be packed. I'm already planning to come back next week." Thomas felt overwhelmed. Less than an hour ago, he had been standing outside in the cold, wondering if he would eat it all today. Now he had money in his pocket, a potential job, and something even more valuable, a reason to hope for the future. "There's just one thing," he said quietly. "I don't have anywhere to stay, nowhere to clean up properly. I can't come to work looking like this every day." The businessman stepped forward again. "Actually, I might be able to help with that too. My brother owns a small apartment building about 6 blocks from here. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe. I could talk to him about letting you stay in one of the smaller units in exchange for some work around the building. Maintenance, cleaning, that sort of thing. And I know where you can get some decent clothes," added Mrs. Chen. "My church runs a clothing program for people who are getting back on their feet. Good quality things, donated by people who want to help." Thomas looked around at all these people who had been complete strangers an hour ago, and were now offering to help rebuild his life. He felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of gratitude and disbelief. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "I don't know how to thank all of you." "You don't need to thank us," Mrs. Chen said gently. "You've already given us something precious. You've reminded us that beautiful things can happen when we least expect them, and that everyone deserves a chance to share their gifts with the world." Mr. Rodriguez nodded. "When can you start? I mean, if you want to accept the offer." Thomas wiped his eyes and looked around the cafe. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, casting warm light on the piano keys. A few new customers had come in during the conversation and were looking curiously at the gathered crowd. "I can start tomorrow," he said, "if that works for you." "It works perfectly," Mr. Rodriguez said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the team." As they shook hands, Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not completely healed. He knew the grief and pain from losing his wife would always be part of him. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt like himself again. He felt like a musician. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but many people lingered to talk with Thomas, to ask about his background, to tell him how much his performance had meant to them. Several exchanged phone numbers and promised to return when he played again. As the cafe returned to its normal rhythm, Thomas remained at the piano. He played softly now, gentle melodies that seemed to float in the background of conversations and coffee orders. It felt natural, right? Like this was where he belonged. Mrs. Chen stayed until closing time, working on her sheet music and occasionally looking up to smile at Thomas. When it was time to leave, she walked over to the piano one more time. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've always believed that music has the power to heal both the person playing it and the people listening. Today I think we all got a little bit of healing." Thomas nodded, playing a soft chord progression that seemed to echo her words. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing something in me that I had forgotten was there." "It was always there," she replied. "Sometimes we just need someone to remind us who we really are." As Thomas played the final notes of the day, he thought about tomorrow, about the chance to play music again, about the possibility of rebuilding his life one song at a time. The music hadn't brought his wife back or erased the pain of losing her, but it had given him something he thought was gone forever: hope for the future.